Friends, thank you for being here today. We need to talk about the border. Not the physical border with its checkpoints and customs officers, but the psychological one. For nearly a century, the relationship between the United States and Canada has been defined by a very specific, unspoken dynamic. It is the dynamic of the elephant and the mouse, as Pierre Trudeau famously put it. The United States is the loud, imposing, world-shaping superpower. Canada is the polite neighbor to the north, reliable, accommodating, endlessly apologetic, and above all, compliant. Washington has always operated on a foundational assumption. No matter how hard you push Ottawa, no matter what tariffs you threaten, no matter how aggressively you leverage the asymmetry of your economy, Canada will eventually fold. They have to. They have nowhere else to go. But what happens when the polite neighbor finally stops apologizing? What happens when the mouse realizes that it actually holds the master key to the elephant's entire house? Before we dive into this leaked simulation, I want to hear from you right now. Do you think Canada has played the polite neighbor for way too long? Drop a yes in the comments if you think it's time for Ottawa to finally show some teeth. Let me know your thoughts. Let's get into it. Right now, in the real world, the anxiety in Ottawa is palpable. The Trump administration is playing an aggressive game of hardball, weaponizing tariffs, tearing up the traditional rulebook of alliances, and treating historic partners like subordinate customer states. The threats emanating from the White House are real. The economic pressure is mounting, and the Canadian public is feeling a deep, collective sense of vulnerability. But behind closed doors, in the dark, smoke-filled rooms of Washington's most exclusive deep state think tanks and private political intelligence firms, a different story is unfolding. A document has been circulating like wildfire. It is not a leak of actual events, but something far more dangerous to the current administration's worldview. A highly detailed, mathematically rigorous geopolitical wargame. It is known among insiders as the March 1st simulation. This simulation is a strategic blueprint, a hypothetical, terrifyingly plausible scenario that exposes the fatal, catastrophic flaw in Donald Trump's America First bullying. It models exactly what would happen if Canada decided to stop playing the victim and started playing hard power. And the results of this simulation have left American strategists in a cold sweat. Because if Canada ever decides to actually use this playbook, it would fundamentally alter the architecture of North American power in exactly 24 hours. Let's step inside the simulation and see exactly how the polite neighbor brings the superpower to its knees. To understand how this unfolds, we have to look at where the scenario begins. It starts on a hypothetical Sunday, March 1st. The tension between the two nations has reached a boiling point over tariffs and trade barriers. At exactly 1:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the secure line rings in the Prime Minister's office in Ottawa. It is the President of the United States. Donald Trump is calling Prime Minister Mark Carney. In the wargame, the scenario designers script Trump to offer what he believes is a masterstroke, a Godfather offer that Canada cannot possibly refuse. It is an ultimatum perfectly disguised as a lifeline. Trump tells Carney that he wants to make all the pain go away. He offers a total suspension of all the punishing tariffs on Canadian goods. He promises to reaffirm the United States' commitment to NORAD, the Joint Aerospace Defense Command. He guarantees the immediate restoration of full, unrestricted intelligence sharing. To the untrained eye, to the desperate Canadian public, it sounds like a miraculous diplomatic victory. It sounds like salvation. But there is a poison pill hidden inside this generous offer. Trump demands one thing in exchange: energy security guarantees. The simulated terms are brutally specific. Canada must legally obligate itself to export a minimum of 3.8 million barrels of crude oil per day, 2.7 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day, and 1,400 megawatts of electricity per hour directly to the United States. Furthermore, these exports must be delivered at strictly capped prices, no more than a 15% premium over what is charged to other global buyers. And the kicker? This agreement must be locked in for the next 10 years, complete with a devastating penalty clause. If Canada restricts exports or raises prices beyond the cap, they will face automatic financial penalties of $500 million every single month. The architects of the simulation understand exactly why this is a trap. This is not a trade deal. It is a demand for absolute codified surrender. If Canada accepts this hypothetical deal, it signs away its sovereign control over its own natural resources for a decade. It institutionalizes its own defenselessness. For the next 10 years, Trump or any subsequent U.S. president could do whatever they wanted to Canada, slap tariffs on softwood lumber, block Canadian steel, undermine Canadian tech, and Canada would be legally paralyzed. They could not use their greatest weapon, their energy supply, to retaliate. By accepting, Canada agrees to be permanently downgraded from a sovereign partner to a subordinate supplier state. It is a velvet-lined geopolitical prison. Trump, in the simulation, urges immediate acceptance. He gives Carney 3 hours. He thinks he has won. Pause for a second. Put yourself in the Prime Minister's shoes. You have 3 hours on the clock. Do you accept the deal to save the economy today, or do you reject it and risk a full-blown trade war? Tell me exactly what you would do down in the comments below. I'm really curious to see how many of you would take the deal versus fighting back. But the simulation doesn't end with Trump's ultimatum. Let's fast forward in the war game to 4:23 p.m. Prime Minister Mark Carney steps up to the podium in the National Press Theatre in Ottawa. The hypothetical world is watching. The markets, though closed for the weekend, are holding their collective breath. The U.S. State Department expects a typical Canadian response: a diplomatic hedge, a request for further study, perhaps a counteroffer pleading for a 5-year term instead of 10. Instead, the simulation scripts Carney to look directly into the camera and deliver a masterclass in diplomatic warfare. He doesn't hedge. He doesn't ask for a counteroffer. He utters 4 words that shatter the paradigm. The answer is no. It is what follows those 4 words that makes this simulation a masterpiece of strategic theory. The rejection isn't just a simple refusal. It is systematically structured to dismantle Washington's entire argument. His first line of defense is constitutional reality. In Canada, natural resources do not belong to the federal government in Ottawa. They fall strictly under provincial jurisdiction. The federal government literally does not have the unilateral constitutional authority to bind provincial resource decisions to a foreign power for a decade. By demanding this, Trump was demanding something Canada legally could not give. Carney uses the U.S. administration's ignorance of Canadian constitutional law against them, framing the American demand as an illegal overreach. He then moves on to the concept of leverage. Carney articulates what every geopolitical scholar knows but rarely says out loud. Signing away your right to retaliate is not a peace treaty. It is a capitulation with a 10-year warranty. A contract that removes your ability to respond to the other party's future bad behavior does not resolve a conflict. It merely guarantees that you will lose every future conflict. Canada refuses to institutionalize its own defenselessness. Canada proposes building entirely new, state-of-the-art export terminals. They map out new Pacific Coast terminals in British Columbia to load liquefied natural gas and crude onto supertankers bound for energy-starved Asian markets like Japan, South Korea, and India. They plan new Atlantic terminals in the east to serve European allies, Germany, France, the UK, who are desperate to permanently sever their reliance on Russian gas and Middle Eastern instability. By utilizing international defense and security funds, Canada expedites the construction of these parallel export pathways. They don't cut off the U.S., they simply create a genuine market choice. They build the bypass. But the simulation does not stop at the conceptualization of new ports. The architects of this leaked war game pushed the timeline forward, running the algorithms to predict exactly how the geopolitical chessboard would rearrange itself in the aftermath of Canada's global pivot. They modeled the subsequent 24 months, and the resulting data paints a picture of a world turned completely upside down. The simulation projects 3 distinct pathways for how Washington might react to Ottawa's defiance, and every single one of them represents a structural defeat for traditional American hegemony. Let us break down these 3 modeled futures. The first is the competitive bidding scenario. In this pathway, the pragmatic adults in the room at the Pentagon and the Department of Energy managed to wrestle the steering wheel away from the political operatives in the White House. Realizing the catastrophic implications of losing their primary energy feedstock, the United States formally enters the auction. They submit a bid just like the other 11 nations. Over the next 60 days, Canada runs a documented, highly transparent competitive process. If the United States participates and matches the terms, Canadian energy continues flowing south, but upon a drastically different contractual foundation. It flows not as a captive resource, but as a premium commodity bought on the open market. The United States loses its historic home field discount. It is forced to accept a fundamental, humiliating change in the structural terms of the relationship. Canada is no longer a captive supplier, it is a sovereign seller, and Washington must pay full price for the privilege of access, but it is his final point that drops the absolute geopolitical hammer. This is the moment the simulation shifts from a defensive maneuver to an offensive strike. Carney announces a global pivot. He steps to the microphone and delivers the mic drop. As of today, Canada has received formal purchase proposals from 11 countries on 4 continents. We are evaluating all of them. The United States is welcome to compete for Canadian energy on the same terms as everyone else. With those hypothetical sentences, the era of assumed American preferential access is terminated. The United States is no longer the sole master of the continent. It is just another customer standing in line behind Japan, Germany, India, and South Korea. It is a market announcement that changes the balance of global power. Now, let us step out of the simulation for a moment and look at the cold, hard, verifiable reality beneath this fiction. Why does this leaked wargame terrify Washington strategists so deeply? Because the underlying mechanics of the simulation are based on absolute, undeniable fact. In the simulation, Trump responds to Carney's rejection with a furious Truth Social post, claiming that America doesn't need Canadian energy and telling Canada to go ahead and try selling to China. In the real world, this is the exact kind of bluster we hear from the America First crowd. And in the real world, it is a scientifically and economically illiterate bluff. Let's do a reality check on the American energy grid. The United States is the largest oil producer in the world. But here is the secret that politicians in Washington desperately try to ignore. 60% of all American oil imports come from Canada. Why? If America pumps so much oil in Texas and North Dakota, why do they need Alberta? The answer is refinery addiction. It is about chemistry, not just geography. The oil that comes out of the American shale boom is light, sweet crude. But the massive multi-billion-dollar refineries scattered across the American Midwest and the Gulf Coast, facilities owned by giants like Valero, Phillips 66, and Marathon Petroleum, were not built for light, sweet crude. Decades ago, they invested billions to install massive cokers and specialized thermal cracking units specifically designed to process heavy, sour crude. And where does the vast majority of the world's heavy, sour crude come from? The oil sands of Alberta, Canada? These American refineries are literally chemically engineered and custom built to run on a diet of Canadian oil known as Western Canadian Select. You cannot simply flip a switch and run Texas light sweet through a refinery designed for Alberta heavy sour. The equipment would fail, the yield of diesel and jet fuel would collapse. Switching alternative crude sources would require years of environmental permitting, billions of dollars in structural modification, and massive engineering overhauls. So when the US president claims he doesn't need Canadian oil, he is lying to his own people. It is the geopolitical equivalent of a hospital administrator claiming the hospital doesn't need electricity because they have plenty of Band-Aids. The American industrial complex is fundamentally, structurally, and chemically addicted to the very Canadian energy the White House threatens to tariff. The simulation knows this, and the market knows this. Understanding that refinery addiction brings us to the immediate financial fallout. The simulation models exactly what would happen if this fictional Sunday showdown met the real-world Monday morning opening bell on Wall Street. Imagine the scene. It's 9:30 a.m. in New York. The bells ring. The algorithms process the fact that Canada has just put its 3.8 million barrels a day up for global auction. The result is an instantaneous, apocalyptic financial bloodbath for American energy security. Within 15 minutes of the market opening, the simulation projects West Texas Intermediate crude futures spiking by 7.2%. Natural gas futures for delivery to the American Midwest don't just spike, they explode by 14.3%, signaling immediate panic-inducing shortages for heating and electricity generation across half the United States. But the real devastation is laser-focused on the companies that made the mistake of trusting Washington's diplomatic competence. The U.S. refineries that depend on Canadian crude go into freefall. The simulation maps it out brutally. Valero Energy plunges 11%, Phillips 66 craters 9%, Marathon Petroleum sees a catastrophic 13% of its market capitalization wiped out in a single morning. This isn't just numbers on a screen. A 13% decline in Marathon Petroleum means panic in the boardrooms. It means tens of thousands of American union workers in the Midwest and Gulf Coast suddenly realizing their facilities might not have the feedstock to operate next month. The market in this war game isn't reacting to political rhetoric or a diplomatic bluff. It is pricing in a structural shift. The free market, the ultimate arbiter of truth, is screaming that America First is a suicide pact if it isolates the Canadian energy supply. Quick question for you guys. Did you know the U.S. Midwest was this structurally dependent on Canadian heavy crude? I bet most American voters have no idea. Let me know in the comments if this refinery addiction surprised you as much as it surprised me. But having the upper hand in theory doesn't mean much unless you can physically pull it off. So how does Canada actually execute this? Critics of this strategy always point to the same perceived flaw. The pipelines all flow south. They argue that Canada is landlocked by its own infrastructure and has to sell to the U.S. This is where the simulation reveals its ultimate endgame, effectively drawing up a brand new architectural blueprint for North America. The brilliant loophole in the Canadian hypothetical strategy is that Ottawa does not need to reverse the massive existing southward pipelines like Keystone or Enbridge. Trying to push oil backward is slow and technologically fraught. Instead, the simulation posits that Canada leverages a completely new geopolitical vehicle, NATO's alternative security infrastructure funding. The second pathway is the accelerated infrastructure race. In this scenario, Washington allows its wounded pride to dictate its policy. The U.S. refuses to bid, relying instead on empty threats. Canada responds by slamming its foot on the gas pedal of the NATO funding mechanism. Construction on the Atlantic and Pacific terminals moves at wartime speed. As the global market realizes that a massive percentage of North American energy is about to be permanently diverted away from the U.S. grid, American energy prices begin a slow, tortuous climb. Inflation rips through the U.S. manufacturing sector. The dependence on Canadian energy is permanently reduced, but not because Canada stopped pumping. It is reduced because Canada's new infrastructure gives them the freedom to look the other way. This scenario is economically excruciating for American consumers, but strategically liberating for Canada. It permanently severs the umbilical cord of dependency, but it is the third modeled future that truly keeps Washington up at night, the crisis escalation scenario. In this pathway, Trump doubles down. Enraged by the Canadian defiance, the administration imposes punitive, scorched earth sanctions. They attempt to close the border to Canadian non-energy goods, sparking a full-blown trade war. Canada responds with the ultimate trump card, a sheer, immediate reduction of southward flow. The valves are tightened. What makes the crisis escalation scenario so terrifying to U.S. insiders is not just the economic math, it is the electoral arithmetic. The simulation maps out the domestic political blast radius of a Canadian energy restriction, and the results are lethal to the current administration. If Ottawa redirects even 30% of its current U.S.-bound heavy crude to those new Asian buyers, the Midwest refineries face immediate, unmitigable supply shortfalls. They cannot quickly replace that heavy, sour crude. Production slows to a crawl. Within weeks, retail gasoline prices in key states Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Ohio skyrocket to $7 or $8 a gallon. Look at that map again. Those aren't just states. Those are the defining battlegrounds of American electoral politics. The simulation proves that a Canadian energy squeeze would utterly annihilate the economic standing of the American working class in the exact regions that handed Donald Trump his political power. The irony modeled in the war game is thick enough to cut with a knife. The America First agenda ends up systematically dismantling the livelihoods of the American blue-collar voter. The resulting domestic political outrage becomes so severe and the electoral consequences so dire that the White House is forced into an unconditional, deeply embarrassing reversal of its entire confrontational posture. While Washington grapples with its self-inflicted domestic crisis, the simulation turns its lens across the oceans to the 11 nations that submitted those purchase proposals. To understand the sheer magnitude of Canada's newfound leverage, we have to look at exactly who is standing in that line. This is where the Carney simulation evolves from a North American trade dispute into a total global realignment. Across the Atlantic, the European Union has spent the last several years scrambling in the dark, desperately trying to untangle its massive industrial economies from the suffocating grip of Russian natural gas. The war in Ukraine exposed a structural vulnerability that Europe swore it would never repeat. They have spent billions building LNG import terminals, but they lack a reliable, democratic partner with the sheer volume required to replace Moscow long term. In the simulation, Canada steps into that void. Germany, France, and the United Kingdom are modeling long-term, multi-decade purchase agreements that would permanently cement Canada as the savior of European energy security. Ottawa isn't just selling gas, they are selling geopolitical stability. Across the Pacific, the dynamic is equally ferocious. Japan and South Korea, two massive, hyper-industrialized economies with virtually zero domestic energy resources, live in constant fear of supply chain disruptions in the South China Sea and the Strait of Hormuz. They view Canadian energy as the holy grail, a massive, secure supply coming from a stable democracy across the open, uncontested waters of the northern Pacific. And then there is China. The simulation models Beijing eagerly submitting a premium bid for Canadian crude, not just because they need the oil, but because they recognize an unprecedented opportunity to humiliate Washington in its own backyard. By driving a wedge between the U.S. and its closest ally, Beijing achieves a strategic victory without firing a single shot. By pitting the economic interests of Asia and Europe against the political hubris of Washington, Canada masterfully orchestrates a global bidding war where Ottawa holds all the cards. Finally, the simulation models the most intangible, yet most permanent variable of all, the Canadian psyche. For generations, the Canadian political establishment has operated under a cloud of deep-seated insecurity, paralyzed by the fear of angering their southern neighbor. The political culture in Ottawa has always been defined by risk aversion and damage control. But as the simulated months roll on, and the revenue from global buyers begins pouring in, the war game projects a profound psychological awakening across Canada. The realization dawns from Bay Street to Parliament Hill that politeness is not a substitute for policy, and that being a good neighbor does not require being a subservient one. Canada transforms from a timid supplier state into a confident, assertive energy superpower. They stop asking for permission to prosper. They stop negotiating from a position of manufactured weakness. The core lesson of the Carney simulation is a masterclass in modern power dynamics. It delivers an overarching theme that every student of history must understand. Leverage in international relations does not belong to the nation with the loudest voice. It does not belong to the nation with the biggest military. It does not even belong to the nation with the largest economy. Leverage belongs to the party with the most credible alternatives. For decades, the United States assumed total compliance from Canada because Canada suffered from a profound absence of credible alternatives. The infrastructure flowed south, the money flowed south, the mindset flowed south. Washington acted like a monopoly buyer because, for all intents and purposes, it was. But the simulation proves that this dependency is a choice, not a geographic destiny. The blueprints exist, the global buyers are waiting with open checkbooks, the resources are in the ground. Canada has the capacity to flip the geopolitical board overnight. This leaked wargame is not just a warning to Washington. It is a profound call to empowerment for the Canadian people and for everyone watching who despises the bullying tactics of the current U.S. administration. It shatters the illusion of American omnipotence. It reveals that the bully only has power as long as the victim refuses to walk out the door. Ottawa is not trapped in a room with Donald Trump. Donald Trump's economy, his refineries, his Midwestern voters, and his energy security are trapped in a room with Ottawa. The polite neighbor holds the keys. The simulation shows exactly how to turn the lock. But here is the final question, and this is the one I want you to debate in the comments. Does the current leadership in Ottawa actually have the political courage to pull this off? Will they finally play hardball, or will they fold like they have in the past? I read every single comment, so tell me your exact thoughts down below. If you found this analysis eye-opening, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video so others can see the real geopolitical chessboard. Thank you.